Hello, and this is Miss Yetter, and we are continuing reading Hollow City, the second novel, and Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. We are on Chapter 11, Part 2. So if you will turn in your novels with me to page 297, we will start at the very top of the page after the word flailing. So that is page 297. Melinda freaked out. "Come back here," she shouted, furious, about to run after the birds when Bronwyn caught her by the arms. "Wait," said Bronwyn. "I'm sure Miss P knows what she's doing." Miss Peregrine stopped a little way down the track, well out of anyone's reach. The pigeon struggled in her beak, and Melina struggled against Bronwyn, both in vain. Miss Peregrine seemed to be waiting for the pigeon to tire out and give up. But then she got impatient and began swinging the pigeon around in the air by its leg. "Please, Miss P," Olive shouted, "you'll kill it." I was close to rushing over and breaking it up myself, but the birds were a blur of talons and beaks, and no one could get close enough to separate them. We yelled and begged Miss Peregrine to stop. Finally she did. The pigeon dropped from her mouth and wobbled on its feet, too stunned to flee. Miss Peregrine warbled at it the way she had earlier, and this time the pigeon chirped in response. Then Miss Peregrine tapped the ground with her beak 3 times, then 10 times, then 5. 3, 10, 5. Olive tried the combination. The lock popped open. The door swung inward, and a rope ladder unrolled down the wall to meet the floor. Miss Peregrine's interrogation had worked. She'd done what she needed to do to help us all, and given that, we might have overlooked her behavior, if not for what happened next. She took the dazed pigeon by its leg again and, seemingly out of spite, flung it hard against the wall. We reacted with a great collective gasp of horror. I was shocked beyond speaking. Melina broke away from Bronwyn and ran to pick up the pigeon. It hung limply from her hand, its neck broken. "Oh, my bird, she's killed it," cried Bronwyn. "All we went through to catch that thing," said Hugh. "And now look, I'm going to stomp your embryon's head," Melina shrieked, crazed with rage. Bronwyn caught her arms again. "No, you're not. Stop it. Your embryon's a savage. If that's how she conducts herself, we're better off with the whites." "You take that back," shouted Hugh. "I won't," Melina said. More harsh words were exchanged. A fist fight was narrowly avoided. Bronwyn held Melina, and Emma and I held Hugh until the fight went out of them, if not the bitterness. No one could quite believe what Miss Peregrine had done. "What's the big fuss?" said Enoch. "It was just a stupid pigeon." "No, it wasn't," said Emma, scolding Miss Peregrine directly. "That bird was a personal friend of Miss Wren's. It was hundreds of years old. It was written about in the tales, and now it's dead." "Murdered," said Melina, and she spat on the ground. "That's what it's called when you kill something for no reason." Miss Peregrine nibbled casually at a mite under her wing, as if she hadn't heard any of this. Something wicked's gotten into her," said Olive. "That isn't like Miss Peregrine at all." She's changing," said Hugh, "becoming more animal. I hope there's still something human left in her to rescue," Millard said darkly. "So did we all." We climbed out of the tunnel, each of us lost in our own anxious thoughts. Beyond the door was a passage that led to a flight of steps that led to another passage and another door, which opened onto a room filled with daylight and packed to the rafters with clothes. Racks and closets and wardrobes stuffed with them. There were also 2 wooden privacy screens to change behind, some freestanding mirrors, and a work table laid out with sewing machines and bolts of raw fabric. It was half boutique, half workshop, and a paradise to Horace, who particularly cartwheeled inside, crying, "I'm in heaven." Melina lurked sullenly at the rear, not speaking to anyone. "What is this place?" I asked. "It's a disguising room," Millard answered, "designed to help visiting peculiars blend in with this loop's normals." He pointed out a framed illustration demonstrating how clothes of the period were worn. "When in Rome," said Horace, bounding toward a rack of clothes, "Emma asked everyone to change. In addition to helping us blend in, new clothes might also throw off any whites who'd been tracking us. But keep your sweaters on underneath in case more trouble finds us." Bronwyn and Olive took some plain-looking dresses behind a screen. I traded my ash-coated, sweat-stained pants and jacket for a mismatched but relatively clean suit. Instantly uncomfortable, I wondered how, for so many centuries, people wore such stiff, formal clothes all the time. Millard put on a sharp-looking outfit and sat down in front of a mirror. "How do I look?" he said. "Like an invisible boy wearing clothes?" replied Horace. Millard sighed, lingering in front of the mirror a bit longer, then stripped and disappeared again. Horace's initial excitement had already waned. "The selection here is atrocious," he complained. "If the clothes aren't moth-eaten, they're patched with clashing fabrics. I am so weary of looking like a street urchin." "Street urchins blend," Emma said from behind her changing screen. "Little gents in top hats do not." She emerged wearing shiny red flats and a short-sleeved blue dress that fell just below the knee. "What do you think?" she said, twirling to make the dress billow. She looked like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, only cuter. I didn't know how to tell her this in front of everyone, though, so instead I gave her an awkward grin and a thumbs up. She laughed. "Like it? Well, that's too bad," she said with a coy smile. I'd stick out like a sore thumb. Then a pained expression crossed her face, as if she felt guilty for laughing, for having had even a moment of fun, given all that had happened to us and everything yet to be resolved. And she ducked behind the screen again. I felt it too, the dread. The weight of the horrors we'd seen, which replayed themselves in an endless, lurid loop in my mind. "But you can't feel bad every second," I wanted to tell her. "Laughing doesn't make bad things worse any more than crying makes them better. It doesn't mean you don't care or that you've forgotten. It just means you're human." But I don't know how to say this either. When she came out again, she had on a sack-like blouse with ripped sleeves and a broomstick skirt that brushed the top of her feet, much more urchin-like. She'd kept the red shoes, though. Emma could never resist a touch of glitter, however small. "And this," said Horace, waving a poofy orange wig he'd found, "how's this going to help anyone blend in with the normals?" "Because it seems we're going to a carnival," said Hugh, looking up at a poster on the wall that advertised one. "Just a moment," Horace said, joining Hugh beneath the poster. "I've heard of this place. It's an old tourist loop." "What's a tourist loop?" I asked. "Used to be you could find them all across Peculiardom," Millard explained, "placed strategically at times and locations of historical import. They made up a sort of grand tour that was once considered an essential part of any well-bred peculiar's education. This was many years ago, of course, when it was still relatively safe to travel abroad. I didn't realize there were any left." Then he got quiet, lost in memories of a better time. When we'd all finished changing, we left our 20th century clothes in a heap and followed Emma through another door, out into an alleyway stacked with trash and empty crates. I recognized the sounds of a carnival in the distance, the arrhythmic wheeze of pipe organs, the dull roar of a crowd. Even though my nerves and exhaustion, I felt a jangle of excitement. Once this was something peculiars had come from far and wide to see. My parents had never even taken me to Disney World. Emma gave the unusual instructions. Stay together, watch Jacob and me for signals. Don't talk to anyone and look no one in the eye. How will we know where to go, said Olive. We'll have to think like Imbrams, Emma said. If you were Miss Wren, where would you be hiding? Anywhere but London, said Enoch. If only someone hadn't murdered the pigeon, Bronwyn said, staring bitterly at Miss Peregrine. The headmistress stood on the cobblestones looking up at us, but no one wanted to touch her. We had to keep her out of sight, though, so Horace went back into the disguising room and fetched a denim sack. Miss Peregrine wasn't enthusiastic about this arrangement, but when it came clear that no one was going to pick her up, least of all Bronwyn, who seemed entirely disgusted with her, she climbed inside and let Horace knot the top, closed with a strip of leather. We followed the drunken sound of the carnival through a snarl of cramped lanes, where from wooden crates vendors hawked vegetables and dusty sacks of grain and freshly killed rabbits, where children and thin cats skulked and prowled with hungry eyes, and women with proud, dirty faces squatted in the gutter peeling potatoes, building little mountains with the tossed-away skins. Though we tried very hard to slink by unnoticed, every one of them seemed to turn and stare as we passed. The vendors, the children, the women, the cats, the dead, milk-eyed rabbits swinging from their legs. Even in my new period-appropriate clothes, I felt transparently out of place. Blending in was as much about performance as about costume, I realized, and my friends and I carried ourselves with none of the slumped shoulders, shifty-eyed attitude that these people did. In the future, if I wanted to disguise myself as effectively as the whites, I'd have to sharpen my acting skills. The carnival grew louder as we went, and the smells stronger. Overcooked meats, roasted nuts, horse manure, human manure, and the smoke from coal fires all mixed together into something so sickly sweet that it thickened the very air. Finally, we reached a wide square where the carnival was in full rollicking swing, packed with masses of people and brightly colored tents, and more activity than my eyes could take in at once. The whole scene was an assault on my senses. There were acrobats and rope dancers and knife throwers and fire eaters and street performers of every type. A quack doctor pitched patient medicines from the back of a wagon. A rare cordial to fortify the innards against infective parasites, unwholesome damps, and malignant effluvia. Competing for attention on an adjacent stage was a loudmouth showman in coattails and a large prehistoric-looking creature whose gray skin hung from its frame in cascading wrinkles. It took me 10 full seconds as we threaded the crowd past the stage to recognize it as a bear. It had been shaved and tied to a chair and made to wear a woman's dress. And as its eyes bulged in its head, the showman grinned and pretended to serve it tea, shouting, "Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the most beautiful lady in all of Wales," which earned him a big laugh from the crowd. I half hoped it would break its chains and eat him, right there in front of everyone. To combat the dizzying effect of all this dreamlike madness, I reached into my pocket to palm the smooth glass of my phone. Eyes closed for a moment and whispered to myself, "I'm a time traveler. This is real. I, Jacob Portman, am traveling in time." This was astonishing enough. More astonishing, perhaps, was the fact that time travel hadn't broken my brain, that by some miracle I had not yet devolved into a gibbering crazy person ranting on a street corner. The human psyche was much more flexible than I'd imagined, capable of expanding to contain all sorts of contradictions and seeming impossibilities. Lucky for me. "Olive," Bronwyn shouted, "get away from there." I looked up to see her yank Olive away from a clown who had bent down to talk to her. "I've told you time and again, never talk to normals." Our group was large enough that keeping it together could be a challenge, especially in a place like this, full of distractions tailor-made to fascinate children. Bronwyn acted as den mother, rounding us up every time one of us strayed to get a closer look at a stall of brightly colored pinwheels or streaming boiled candy. Olive was the most easily distracted and often seemed to forget that we were in serious danger. It was only possible to keep so many kids in line because they were not actually kids, because there was some older nature inside them wearing against the balancing their childish impulses with actual children. I'm sure it would have been hopeless. For a while, we wandered aimlessly looking for anyone who resembled Miss Wren, or anywhere it seemed peculiars were likely to hide. But everything here seemed peculiar. This entire loop, with all its chaotic strangeness and perfect camouflage, was perfect camouflage for peculiars. And yet, even here, people noticed us, their heads turning subtly as we passed. I started to get paranoid. How many of the people around us were spies for the whites, or whites themselves? I was especially wary of the clown, the one Bronwyn had pulled Olive away from. He kept turning up. We must have passed him 5 times in as many minutes, loitering at the mouth of an alley, staring down from a window, watching us from a tinted photo booth. His mused hair and horrific makeup clashed bizarrely with a backdrop painting of Bacchusilic countryside. He seemed to be everywhere at once. "It's not good being out in the open like this," I said to Emma. "We can't just circle around forever. People are noticing us." "Clowns." "Clowns," she said. "Anyway, I agree with you, but it's difficult to know where to start in all this madness." "We should start at what is always the most peculiar part of any carnival," said Enoch, between us. "The sideshow." He pointed at a tall, gauntly facade at the edge of the square. "Sideshows and peculiars go together like milk and cookies, or hollows and whites." "Usually they do," said Emma, "but the whites know that as well, and I'm sure Miss Wren hasn't kept her freedom this long by hiding in such obvious places." "Have you got a better idea?" said Enoch. We didn't, and so we shifted direction towards the sideshow. I looked back for the leering clown, but he had melted into the crowd. At the sideshow, a scruffy carnival barker was shouting through a megaphone, promising glimpses of the most shocking errors of nature allowed on view by law for a trivial fee. It was called the Congress of Human Oddities. Sounds like dinner parties I've attended, said Horace. Some of these oddities might be peculiar, said Millard, in which case they might know something about Miss Wren. I say it's worth the price of admission. We don't have the price of admission, said Horace, pulling a single lint-flecked coin from his pocket. Since when have we ever paid to get into a sideshow, said Enoch. We followed Enoch around to the back of the sideshow where its wall-like facade gave way to a big flimsy tent. We were scouting for openings to slip through when a flap pulled back and a well-dressed man and woman burst out, the man holding the lady fanning herself. Move aside, the man barked. This woman needs air. A sign above the flap read, performers only. We slipped inside and were immediately stopped. A plain-looking boy sat on a tuft stool near the entrance, apparently in some official capacity. You performers, he said, can't come in unless you're performers. Feigning offense, Emma said, of course we're performers. And to demonstrate, she made a tiny flame on the top of her finger and stubbed it out with her eye. The boy shrugged, unimpressed. Go on, then. We shuffled past him, blinking, our eyes adjusting slowly to the dark. The sideshow was a low-ceilinged maze of canvas, a single dramatically torch-lit aisle that took sharp turns every 20 or 30 feet, so that around each corner we were confronted by a new abomination of nature. A trickle of spectators, some laughing, others pale and shaking, stumbled past us in the opposite direction. The first few freaks were standard issue sideshow fare, and not especially peculiar. An illustrated man covered his tattoos, a bearded lady stroking her long chin whiskers and cackling, a human pincushion who pierced his face with needles and drove nails into his nostrils with a hammer. While I thought this was pretty impressive, my friends, some of whom had traveled Europe in a sideshow with Miss Peregrine, could hardly stifle their yawns. Under a banner that read, The Amazing Matchstick Man, a gentleman with hundreds of matchsticks glued to his suit, body slammed a man similarly clothed in matchsticks, causing flames to erupt across the matchstick man's chest as he flailed in fake terror. Amateurs, Emma muttered as she pulled us on to the next attraction. The oddities got progressively odder. There was a girl in a long fringed dress who wore a giant python around her body, which wriggled and danced at her command. Emma allowed that this was at least marginally peculiar, since the ability to enchant snakes was something only Cindergasty could do. But then Emma mentioned Miss Wren to the girl. She gave us a hard stare, and her snake hissed and showed its fangs, and we moved on. This is a waste of time, said Enoch. Miss Peregrine's clock is running out, and we're touring a carnival. Why not get some sweets and make a day of it? There was only one more freak to see, though. So we continued on. The final stage was empty, but for a plain backdrop, a small table with flowers on it, and an easel-propped sign that read, The World-Famous Folding Man. A stagehand walked onto the stage lugging a suitcase. He set the case down and left. A crowd gathered. The suitcase sat there, center stage. People began to shout, On with the show, and bring out the freak. The suitcase jiggled, then it began to shake, wobbling back and forth until it toppled onto its side. The crowd pressed toward the stage, fixated on the case. Its latches popped, and very slowly the case began to open. A pair of wide eyes peeped out at the crowd, and then the case opened a little more to reveal a face that an adult man with a neatly trimmed mustache and little round glasses, who had somehow folded himself into a suitcase no larger than a torso. The crowd burst into applause, which increased as the freak proceeded to unfold himself limb by limb and step out of the impossibly small case. He was very tall and as skinny as a beanpole, so alarmingly thin, in fact, that it looked as if his bones were about to break through his skin. He was a human exclamation point, but carried himself with such dignity that I couldn't laugh at him. He studied the hooting crowd dourly before taking a deep bow. He then took a minute to demonstrate how his limbs could bend in all sorts of exotic ways. His knee twisted so that the top of his foot touched his hip. Then his hips folding so that the knee touched his chest, and after more applause and more bows, the show was over. We lingered as the crowd filtered away. The folding man was leaving the stage when Emma said to him, "You're peculiar, aren't you?" The man stopped. He turned slowly to look at her with an air of imperious annoyance. "Excuse me," he said in a thick Russian accent. "Sorry to corner you this way, but we need to find Miss Wren," Emma said. "We know she's here someplace." "Phew," said the man, dismissing her with a noise halfway between laugh and hawking spit. "It's an emergency," Bronwyn pleaded. The folding man crossed his arms in a bony X and said, "I don't know anything what you say," then walked off the stage. "Now wait," said Bronwyn. "We keep looking." "Now what?" said Bronwyn. "We keep looking," said Emma. "And if we don't find Miss Wren," said Enoch. "We keep looking," Emma said through her teeth. Everyone understood. Everyone understood perfectly well. We were out of options. If this didn't work, if Miss Wren wasn't here, or we couldn't find her soon, then all our efforts would have been for nothing, and Miss Peregrine would be lost just the same as if we'd never come to London at all. We walked out of the sideshow the way we'd come, dejected, past the now empty stages, past the plain-looking boy, out of the tent and into the daylight. We were standing outside the exit, unsure what to do next, when the plain-looking boy leaned out through the flap. "What's the trouble?" he said. "Show weren't to your liking?" "It was fine," I said, waving him off. "Not peculiar enough for you?" he asked. That got our attention. "What'd you say?" said Emma. "Weckling and Rookery," he said, pointing past us toward the far side of the square. "That's where the real show is." And then he winked at us and ducked back into the tent. "That was mysterious," said Hugh. "Did he say peculiar?" said Bronwyn. "What's Wackling and Rookery?" I said. "A place," said Horace. "Someplace in this loop, maybe." "Could be the intersection of two streets," said Emma, and she pulled back the tent flap to ask the boy if this was what he meant, but he was already gone. So we set off through the crowd toward the far end of the square where he'd pointed, our one last thin hope pinned to a couple of oddly named streets we weren't even sure existed. There was a point a few blocks beyond the square where the nose of the crowd faded and was replaced by an industrial clank and clamor, and the rich funk of roasting meat and animal waste was replaced by a stench far worse and unnameable. Crossing a walled river of Stygian sludge, we entered a district of factories and warehouses, of smokestacks belching black stuff into the air, and this is where we found Wackling Street. We walked one way down Wackling looking for rookery until it dead-ended at a large open sewer which Enoch said was the river fleet, then turned and came back to the other way. When we'd passed the point along Wackling where we'd started, the street began to curve and twist, the factories and warehouses shrinking down into squat offices and unassuming buildings with blank faces and no signs, like a neighborhood pure purpose built to be anonymous. The bad feeling I'd been nursing got worse. What if we'd been set up, sent to this deserted part of the city to be ambushed out of view? The street twisted and straightened again, and then I crashed into Emma, who'd been walking in front of me, but had come to a sudden stop. "What's the matter?" I said. In lieu of an answer, she just pointed. Up ahead, at a T-shaped intersection, there was a crowd. Though it had been sticky hot back at the carnival, many of them were bundled in coats and scarves. They were assembled around a peculiar building and stood gazing up at it in dumbfounded wonder, just as we were now. The building itself was nothing special. 4 stories, the top 3 just rows of narrow, rounded windows, like an old office building. It was, in fact, nearly identical to all the buildings around it, with one exception. It was totally encased in ice. Ice covered its windows and doors. Icicles hung like fangs from every sill and ledge. Snow piled from its doorways, collecting in giant heaps on the sidewalk. It looked like a blizzard had struck the building from the inside. I peered at a snow-blasted street sign, R. Carey Stra. "I knew this place," said Melina. "It's the peculiar archives where all our official records are kept." "How do you know that?" said Emma. "Miss Thrust was grooming me to be second assistant to the ombudswoman there. The examinations were very difficult. I've been studying for 21 years. It is supposed to be covered in ice like that." "Is it supposed to be covered in ice like that?" asked Bronwyn. "Not that I'm aware," said Melina. "It's also where the Council of Emeralds convene for the annual nitpicking of the bylaws," said Millard. "The Council of Emeralds meets here," said Horace. "It's awfully humble. I expected a castle or some such." "It's not meant to stand out," said Melina. "You aren't supposed to notice it at all." "They're doing a poor job of keeping it hidden then," said Enoch. "As I said, it's not usually covered in ice." "What do you think happened here?" I asked. "Nothing good," said Millard. "Nothing good at all." There was no questions we'd have to get closer and explore, but that didn't mean we had to rush in like fools. We hung back and watched from a distance. People came and went. Someone tried the door, but it was frozen shut. The crowd thinned a bit. "Tick, tick, tick," said Enoch. "We're wasting time." We cut through what was left of the crowd and stepped onto the icy sidewalk. The building emanated cold, and we shivered and jabbed our hands into our pockets against it. Bronwyn used her strength to pull open the door, and it came straight off, hinges flying. But the hallway it led on to was completely obstructed by ice. It stretched from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, and into the building in a blue and cloudy blur. The same was true of the windows. I wiped the frost from one pane and then another, and through both I could see only ice. It was as if a glacier was being born somewhere in the heart of the place, and its frozen tongues were squeezing out wherever there was an opening. We tried every way we could think of to get inside. We rounded the building looking for a door or a window that wasn't blocked, but every potential entrance was filled with ice. We picked up stones and loose bricks and tried hacking at the ice. but it was almost supernaturally hard. Even Bronwyn could dig no more than a few inches into it. Millard scanned the tales for any mention of the building, but there was nothing, no secret to be found. Finally, we decided to take a calculated risk. We formed a semicircle around Emma to block her from view, and she heated her hands and placed them against the ice wall that filled the hallway. After a minute, they began to sink into the ice, melting water trickling down into puddle around our feet, but the progress was painfully slow, and after 5 minutes she'd only gotten up to her elbows. At this rate, it'll take the rest of the week just to get down the hall, she said, pulling her arms from the ice. Do you think Miss Wren could really be inside? Said Bronwyn. She has to be, Emma said firmly. I find this contingent of optimism positively flabbergasting, said Enoch. If Miss Wren is in there, then she's frozen solid. Emma erupted at him. Doom and gloom, ruin and ruination. I think you'd be happy if the world came to an end tomorrow, just so you could say, I told you so. Enoch blinked at her, surprised, then said very calmly, you may choose to live in a world of fantasy if you like, my dear, but I am a realist. If you ever offend more than simple criticism, Emma said, if you ever gave a single useful suggestion during a crisis, rather than just shrugging your shoulders at the prospect of failure and death, I might be able to tolerate your unrelenting black moods. But as it stands, we've tried everything, Enoch interjected. What could I possibly suggest? There's one thing we haven't tried, Olive said, piping up from the edge of our group. And what's that? Said Emma. Olive decided to show rather than tell us. Leaving the sidewalk, she went into the crowd, turned to face to the building, and called at the top of her lungs, hello, Miss Wren. If you're in there, please come out. We need your... Before we could finish, Bronwyn had tackled her, and the rest of Olive's sentence was delivered into the big girl's armpit. Are you insane? Bronwyn said, bringing Olive back to us under her arm. You're going to get us all found out. She set Olive on the sidewalk and was about to chastise her further when tears began streaming down the little girl's face. What does it matter if we're found out? Said Olive said. If we can't find Miss Wren and we can't save Miss Peregrine, what does it matter if the whole white army descends onto us right now? A lady stepped out of the crowd and approached us. She was older, backbent with age, her face partly obscured by the hood of a cloak. Is she all right? The lady asked. She's fine, thank you, Emma said dismissively. I'm not, said Olive. Nothing is right. All we ever wanted was to live in peace on our island, and then bad things came and hurt our head mistress. Now all we want to do is help her, and we can't even do that. Olive hung her head and began to weep pitifully. Well then, said the woman, it's an awfully good thing you came to see me. Olive looked up and sniffled and said, why is that? And then the woman vanished. Just like that. She disappeared right out of her clothes, and her cloak, suddenly empty, collapsed onto the pavement with an eerie whoop. We were all too stunned to speak until a small bird came hopping out from underneath the folded cloak. I froze, not sure if I should try to catch it. Does anyone know what sort of bird that is? Asked Horace. I believe that's a wren, said Millard. The bird flapped its wings, leaped into the air, and flew away, disappearing around the side of the building. Don't lose her, Emma shouted, and we all took off running after it, slipping and sliding on the ice, rounding the corner into the snow-choked alley that ran between the glaciated building and the one next to it. The bird was gone. Trapped, Emma said. Where'd she go? Then a series of odd sounds came up from the ground beneath our feet. Metallic clanks, voices, and a noise like water flushing. We kicked the snow away to find a pair of golden wooden doors set into the bricks, like the entrance to a coal cellar. The doors were unlatched. We pulled them open. Inside were steps that led down into the dark, covered in a quick melting ice. The meltwater drained loudly into the unseen gutter. Emma crouched and called into the darkness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" "If you're coming," returned a distant voice, "come quickly." Emma stood up, surprised, then shouted, "Who are you?" We waited for an answer. None came. "What are we waiting for?" said Olive. "It's Miss Wren." "We don't know that," said Millard. "We don't know what happened here." "Well, I'm going to find out," said Olive, and before anyone could stop her, she'd gone to the cellar doors and leaped through them, floating gently to the bottom. "I'm still alive," her voice taunted us from the dark. And so we were shamed into following her and climbed down the steps to find a passage tunneled through thick ice. Freezing water dripped from the ceiling and ran down the walls in a steady stream, and it wasn't completely dark after all. Gauzy light glowed from around a turn in the passage ahead. We heard footsteps approaching, a shadow climbing the wall in front of us. Then a cloaked figure appeared at the turn in the passage, silhouetted in the light. "Hello, children," the figure said. I'm Balenciaga Wren, and I'm so pleased you're here."